never imagined his quiet morning at Eagles Rest Farmers Market would unravel one of the largest weapons trafficking rings in American history. When 5 members of the notorious Storm Riders motorcycle gang decided to harass the overweight farmer, they had no clue they were picking a fight with one of the military's most lethal combat specialists. For 8 years, James Cooper had kept his true identity buried, hiding his Delta Force training behind the unassuming life of a local farmer. The extra weight he carried wasn't a disguise, it was just what happened after leaving the military. But beneath those worn overalls and that easygoing smile was a man who had led some of the deadliest operations in modern warfare. So when Lance "Python" Kingston and his Storm Riders zeroed in on the fat farmer that morning, they thought they'd found an easy target. Instead, they set off a chain reaction that would dismantle a criminal empire and expose a weapons pipeline stretching from Montana to Mexico. Before we dive in, let us know, where are you tuning in from? And if this kind of story is right up your alley, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's tale is something truly special. The morning sun cast long shadows over Eagles Rest Farmers Market as James Cooper's old pickup rumbled into its usual spot. Every movement was deliberate as he unloaded crates of fresh produce, each action precise despite his size. At 5 feet 8 inches and nearly 300 pounds, James wasn't a small man, but nothing about the way he worked seemed clumsy. The early morning regulars were already gathering. Ruth Whitaker, sharp as a tack at 70, watched as James arranged his heirloom tomatoes with almost military precision. Not that she knew that's exactly what it was. To her, and to everyone else in Eagles Rest, he was just a friendly farmer who took over the family land after some vague government job back east. "Those tomatoes look especially fine today," Ruth commented, adjusting her shawl against the crisp morning air. "Same seeds my grandmother used," he replied, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as he positioned each tomato. "Some things are worth keeping." Behind his casual tone, James was already assessing his surroundings. 8 years of playing the role hadn't dulled his instincts. He noted the vendors' positions, the sight lines between stalls, the quickest exits. Old habits die hard. His secure phone buzzed in his pocket, a special model disguised as a cheap flip phone. A single message flashed on the screen, "Package moving." 48 hours. James deleted it immediately, his face betraying nothing as he continued chatting with Ruth about tomato care. Then, at 8:47 a.m., came the low, unmistakable growl of motorcycles. Harley-Davidsons. At least 5. Modified exhaust systems. The Storm Riders were early today. Usually, they didn't make their presence known until the market was busier. Ruth tensed at the sound. Oh dear. Those horrible men again. "Maybe they're just passing through," James murmured, though he already knew better. His intel suggested otherwise. The Storm Riders were getting bolder. More aggressive. Something big was coming, and they were flexing their muscles in preparation. The bikes rounded the corner in perfect formation. At the head of the pack was Lance "Python" Kingston, his leather cut proudly displaying the gang's insignia. Behind him rode his inner circle, Sledge, the enforcer, his real name was long forgotten. Reaper, the gang's ghost-like scout. Goliath, nearly as massive as James himself. And 2 new prospects, fresh meat trying to prove themselves. They parked deliberately, blocking part of the market's main entrance. Python dismounted first, exuding the casual arrogance of a man used to being feared. James caught a glimpse of something under his cut, a bulge. New. Python never used to carry a weapon openly. Well, Python called out, his voice carrying over the now hushed market. "Looks like the locals are throwing themselves a little vegetable party." James didn't look up, just kept arranging his produce, every movement slow, precise. Head down. Playing the role. But his peripheral vision took in everything. Sledge was moving through the stalls, casually knocking over displays. Reaper had disappeared behind the flower stand, taking position near the western exit. Goliath stood by the bikes, arms crossed, his sheer size doing most of the intimidation work. The two prospects mimicked him, trying too hard. "Morning, gentlemen," James called out, his tone warm and unbothered. "Looking for some fresh produce?" Python's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing at the friendly greeting. His boots scraped deliberately against the pavement as he stalked toward the stall. James noticed it immediately. Python was favoring his right leg. A limp. Recent injury. Probably within the last 48 hours. "Actually, fat man," Python sneered, stopping in front of James's stall. "We're looking for our cut. Market's on our turf, in case you hadn't heard. Time for everyone to pay their respects." Ruth clutched her shopping bag tighter. "This is outrageous. This market's been here for—" "Ruth," James interrupted gently, "why don't you go help Mrs. Chen with her flower arrangements? I'm sure she'd appreciate the company." The elderly woman hesitated. But there was something in James's voice, something firm, something absolute. And in that moment, she knew better than to argue. She wasn't the only one about to learn that lesson. Ruth hesitated only a second before giving a small nod and shuffling away toward Mrs. Chen's flower stand. Python watched her go, amusement flickering across his face before he turned back to James with a smirk. "Smart move, getting the old lady clear," he said. "Wouldn't want her to see what happens to farmers who don't understand how things work around here." James kept his easygoing smile, but beneath the surface, his mind was in overdrive. He was already calculating, mapping out the positions of every gang member, the number of civilians still within range, and the potential makeshift weapons within arm's reach. "Things work just fine here," he said calmly. "Been working fine for generations." Sledge appeared beside Python, a fat, ripe tomato rolling in his meaty palm. With deliberate slowness, he clenched his fist until the fruit burst, red pulp dripping through his fingers. "Things change, old man," Sledge muttered. "Better learn to adapt." James watched the juice splatter onto his carefully arranged display. 8 years of cover demanded restraint, required him to keep his body language relaxed, his response measured. But something about today felt different. The Storm Riders weren't just throwing their weight around, they were testing the waters, pushing the boundaries. They were building towards something. "Those are $3 each," James said mildly. Python let out an ugly, barking laugh. "You hear that, boys? Farmer thinks he's gonna charge us." He leaned in closer, his breath thick with whiskey. "Maybe we need to teach you some basic economics." James didn't flinch, though the stink of alcohol and amphetamines made Python even more dangerous than usual. His pupils were blown wide, wired, unpredictable. But being high also made him sloppy. He wouldn't notice the small shifts in James's stance, the subtle repositioning of his hands, casual to the untrained eye but designed for explosive movement if things went sideways. "The next few minutes are real important, son," James said quietly, pitching his voice low so only Python could hear. "Might want to think carefully about your next move." For a moment, just a flicker, something unreadable crossed Python's face, uncertainty, hesitation. It vanished quickly beneath his bravado, but James caught it. Then, from across the market, Reaper's voice cut through the tension. "Boss, we got company." James didn't need to look. He already knew. Right on schedule, Chief Anderson's patrol car was rolling onto Market Street. Python straightened, his expression twisting with frustration. He spit onto the pavement, scowling. "This ain't over, fat man," he snarled. "This market's about to learn some hard lessons real soon." The Storm Riders mounted their bikes, engines roaring to life as they peeled away. James exhaled slowly, watching them disappear down the road. Then, without a word, he knelt and began cleaning up the smashed tomato. Around him, vendors cautiously emerged from their hiding spots, conversation resuming in cautious murmurs. Ruth hurried back, face lined with concern. "Oh, James, are you all right? Those terrible men." "I'm fine, Ruth," he assured her, his movements steady as he rearranged his display. "Some folks just need to make themselves feel big by making others feel small." But even as he spoke, his mind was already piecing things together. The Storm Riders' new aggression, Python's sudden need to assert dominance, the presence of a weapon he hadn't carried before, every detail was another piece of the puzzle James had been assembling for months. Then, another buzz in his pocket. Meeting at Jenny's. 1 hour. James deleted the message without hesitation. The Storm Riders thought they'd just flexed on a simple farmer. They had no idea they just triggered a chain of events 8 years in the making. Jenny's Cafe sat at the edge of Eagles Rest's main street, its weathered facade giving no hint of what truly went on inside. The locals knew it for its coffee, the best in 3 counties. But for James, it was something more. He parked his truck around back, his trained eyes immediately noting 3 unfamiliar vehicles. Government plates, subtle but telltale antenna configurations that didn't match civilian models. The cavalry had arrived. As he pushed through the cafe door, the bell above chimed softly. Jenny Parker looked up from behind the counter, her cheerful smile never wavering, though James caught the flicker of recognition in her eyes. At 28, she'd proven herself invaluable to the operation, her cafe serving as the perfect front for gathering intel. "Your usual, James?" she asked casually, already reaching for the pot. The place was nearly empty except for 3 men, each stationed at separate tables, absorbed in newspapers or laptops. To anyone else, they were just regular customers. To James, they were the reason he was here. "Thanks, Jenny," he replied smoothly. "Quiet morning," she added, voice light but with a carefully placed emphasis on the last 2 words. James nodded. He took his coffee and made his way to a corner booth, one that offered clear sight lines of both exits. 5 minutes later, Chief Anderson stepped inside. His uniform was crisp despite the early hour, his movements unhurried as he made small talk with Jenny before finally settling into the booth across from James. "Heard there was some trouble at the market this morning," the chief said, stirring sugar into his coffee. James didn't answer immediately, just took a slow sip, watching the steam curl upward. Then, with the same easygoing calm he'd held all morning, he set his cup down and met the chief's gaze. "Yeah," he said. "And it's just getting started." James stirred his coffee with methodical precision, his movements slow, deliberate. "Nothing serious," he said. "Just some boys trying to look tough." "Boys carrying concealed weapons," Anderson corrected, his voice dropping lower. "Python's never done that before. Times are changing." And James knew it wasn't for the better. Anderson took a measured sip of his coffee. "Your timing was good this morning." "Wasn't my timing," James said mildly. "Got an anonymous tip. Very specific about when I should drive by." A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of James's mouth. The pieces were falling into place exactly as planned. Across the cafe, the third man at the far table neatly folded his newspaper and approached their booth. David Martinez, FBI handler. Though around town, everyone just knew him as the new insurance adjuster. "Mind if I join you?" Martinez slid into the booth without waiting for an answer. "Interesting development this morning. Python's getting bolder." Before James could respond, Jenny flipped the cafe's closed sign and pulled the blinds. The 2 other customers near the doors subtly repositioned themselves, standard protocol for secure briefings. The casual coffee shop atmosphere was gone. This was now a war room. "It's more than that," James said, leaning forward slightly. "The gang's behavior is changing. More aggressive. More organized. They're not just throwing their weight around anymore, they're building up to something." Martinez nodded. "Our sources confirm a major weapons shipment is set to move through their territory. Biggest one yet. But there's something else, chatter about a new player in the region." Anderson's expression darkened. "Cartel?" Martinez exhaled. "Higher up the food chain. Someone's been consolidating independent trafficking routes, bringing them under central control. The Storm Riders are just a small piece of a much bigger operation." James thought back to Python's new weapon, the gang's sudden claims over the market. They're being backed, he said. Given resources. Support. But they're also being tested. Anderson frowned. Tested how? This morning wasn't just about harassment. They were gauging response times, measuring local law enforcement reaction. And they picked the perfect spot to do it. James tapped his finger on the table. The market controls access to 3 major roads. Clear sight lines to the highway. If you were planning to move something large, it's exactly the kind of place you'd want under your control. Martinez slid a tablet across the table. Satellite images from last night. Their compound outside town. James studied the photos. He didn't need to zoom in to recognize the changes: new security measures, reinforced structures, expanded vehicle areas. Every detail screamed preparation. They're converting the compound into a distribution hub, he muttered. We've got a window, Martinez said. 2 days. Maybe 3 before the shipment arrives. After that, if our intel is correct, the entire operation goes dark, fully absorbed under their new backers' protection. Jenny appeared at their table, coffee pot in hand. Her movements were practiced, controlled, but her voice was tight with unease. They're recruiting, too, she murmured. Overheard Sledge at the bar last night talking about new prospects. Not just anyone. Guys with military backgrounds. Specific skill sets. James absorbed this, his mind clicking through every bit of surveillance he'd gathered over the past few months. They're professionalizing, he said finally. Whoever's backing them isn't just giving them firepower. They're turning them from a gang into a structured, disciplined criminal force. Which meant their window was shrinking fast. Martinez exhaled, shaking his head. Then we need to move. Now. Before they fully transition. But we can't just hit the gang, we need the entire operation. The weapons. And most importantly, evidence of their new backer. Anderson leaned back, jaw tight. My deputies aren't equipped for something like this. They won't need to be involved directly, James assured him. But when things go hot, we'll need them ready to lock the town down. He glanced toward the window, scanning the quiet street outside. This morning was just the start. The gang's going to escalate. They'll want to establish total control before the shipment arrives. Anderson looked skeptical. How can you be so sure? James's voice was quiet but firm. Because that's what I do. A heavy silence settled over the table. Martinez studied James, then gave a slow nod. The question is, he said, how do we force their hand? Get them to expose their operation before they're ready? James allowed himself a small smile. They've already given us the opening we need. Martinez arched a brow. How so? This morning, James said. That wasn't just a show of force. They were making a statement. Establishing dominance. They expect the fat farmer to be properly intimidated. Maybe even leave town. And when you don't? Jenny asked quietly. James's smile faded. They'll have to respond. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. And their new backer will demand it. Can't have a simple farmer undermining their authority. Martinez's expression turned grim. It's risky, he admitted. If they're getting professional training, they might see through your cover. James thought back to Python, the way the gang leader had wavered for just a second, just long enough for James to see it. They won't, James said. Because their training will work against them. They're being taught to focus on obvious threats. Law enforcement. Rival gangs. They won't expect me. He let that sink in. Nobody looks twice at an overweight farmer. The plan was forming. The trap was already halfway set. The meeting stretched another hour, plans refined, contingencies discussed. One by one, the others filtered out, leaving James alone in the corner booth, watching the town through the cafe window. Eagle's Rest had always been quiet. Peaceful. A place where people didn't lock their doors. That was about to change. And when it did, James would be ready. Jenny approached, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "You know," she murmured, "I've got a feeling this town's gonna remember your name for a long time." James picked up the cup, staring into the dark liquid, expression unreadable. "Let's hope," he said, "they remember it for the right reasons. They'll come for you directly." Jenny's voice was low, cautious. Python's ego won't let this morning's confrontation slide. James nodded, eyes steady. "I'm counting on it." There was no hesitation, no doubt, just the certainty of a man who had seen too many battles to fear the next one. Sometimes, the best way to expose a hidden enemy was to make yourself look like an easy target. As he drove home, his mind was already running through scenarios, mapping out contingencies. The storm riders thought they'd put a simple farmer in his place this morning. Soon, they'd learn why underestimating an opponent was the deadliest mistake a soldier could make. The sun dipped low over Eagle's Rest as James made his final checks of the farmhouse perimeter. To any observer, he was just finishing his daily routine, checking livestock, securing gates, moving with the unhurried ease of a man winding down for the night. But each movement served a dual purpose. Hidden among the mundane tasks, he adjusted surveillance equipment, fine-tuned motion sensors, and ran quiet diagnostics on security measures that had been installed and refined over 8 years of preparation. Inside the barn, behind what looked like an ordinary storage wall, James accessed his command center. Multiple monitors flickered to life, displaying feeds from hidden cameras positioned throughout the town, watching, listening. Even his FBI handlers didn't know about some of them. James had learned long ago that even the best operations required independence. A secure message flashed across his encrypted terminal. Storm riders mobilizing. Multiple vehicles leaving the compound. James checked his watch. 8:47 p.m. Right on schedule. They wouldn't wait long. A gang like the Storm Riders couldn't let a fat farmer stand up to them without consequences. At 9:12 p.m., the first vehicle appeared on his perimeter cameras, a black SUV creeping past his property with its headlights off. James recognized the driver immediately. Reaper. The gang's scout. 2 more vehicles followed at irregular intervals, taking strategic positions around the farm's access points. Their approach was methodical, deliberate, not the reckless movements of street thugs, but something else. His phone buzzed. Jenny. "They were in here earlier," she whispered. "Python and Sledge, loud enough for me to hear. They're planning to make an example out of you." "Any specifics?" "They're coming tonight." Her voice was tight with concern. "Python's bringing in extra muscle from their northern chapter. At least 8 men. Maybe more." She hesitated. They were talking about burning down the barn. Killing your livestock. Making sure you can't sell at the market anymore. James allowed himself a small smile. "Appreciate the warning. You should close up early tonight, Jenny. Stay clear of Main Street." "James," she exhaled. "These aren't just regular thugs anymore. The new guys, they move differently. Military training. I'd bet on it." "Good." His tone didn't waver. "That'll make things more interesting." He ended the call before she could protest. On the thermal imaging feed, 8 heat signatures flickered in the surrounding fields. Their approach was textbook, coordinated, tactical. Former military. No doubt about it. James moved to a locked cabinet, entering a precise combination. Inside, his old tactical gear lay waiting. Meticulously maintained. Never forgotten. Tonight, it would finally be put to use. He geared up with practiced efficiency. Muscle memory took over, his hands working on autopilot. The extra weight he'd gained over the years made the vest fit differently, but he had accounted for that. At 9:45 p.m., the first move came. Engines revved in the darkness. Bikes circling the property, just out of sight. A classic intimidation tactic. Noise. Pressure. Trying to rattle their target. James used their own distraction against them, slipping through a hidden exit in the barn, moving toward a prepared observation post. He already knew how this would play out. Time to send a message. From the darkness, Python's voice rang out. Nobody disrespects the Storm Riders. A pause. Especially not some fat farmer. Through his thermal scope, James watched as the gang split into 3 teams. Their approach was professional, covering angles, maintaining communication, moving from cover to cover. Whoever was backing them wasn't just funding them. They were training them. But they'd made one fatal error. They assumed they were dealing with an ordinary farmer. At exactly 10 p.m., the first team breached the front door. Through the radio chatter, James heard them moving through the house, searching methodically. "House is clear," one of them reported. "No sign of him. But a lot of weird ST guys got cameras everywhere." Python's response was immediate. "Find the recordings. Grab anything that could have evidence of our operations. Then burn it all." James keyed his own radio, a secure frequency linked directly to Martinez. "They've taken the bait. Moving to phase 2. Local deputies are staged 5 minutes out," Martinez confirmed. Then, after a brief pause, "Sure you don't want backup closer?" James's voice remained calm. "Negative. This needs to look real. If they sense a setup, we lose everything." His grip tightened around his rifle. "This ends tonight." James moved like a shadow. Despite his size, he was practically invisible as he approached Python's SUV. The gang leader was too focused on coordinating his teams to notice, until it was too late. In one smooth motion, James yanked open the door and locked Python in a control hold before he could react. The gang leader's radio clattered to the floorboard. "Evening, son," James murmured, tightening his grip. "Might want to tell your boys to stand down before this gets messy." Python struggled, but James's Delta Force training made escape impossible. "How?" Python choked out. "You're just a farmer." Actually, James applied a little more pressure. "I'm the guy who's been investigating your weapons operation for 8 years. And thanks to you, I just confirmed every suspicion I had." Python's eyes widened, realization dawning, right before shots rang out from the barn. "Boss!" Sledge's panicked voice crackled over the radio. "You need to see this. This isn't just a farm, it's a goddamn intelligence center." James sighed. "Guess we're doing this the hard way." In one quick movement, he rendered Python unconscious. "Martinez," James spoke into his secure radio. "Move in. But let some of them escape. We need this to look real." And just like that, all hell broke loose. James moved through the chaos with deadly precision, systematically dismantling the Storm Riders' assault teams. The gang's military training worked against them. They expected textbook tactics. What they got was something far deadlier. One by one, they fell, some subdued, some fleeing back to their compound. By the time police sirens cut through the night, the trap was set. Enough evidence had been discovered to justify an official investigation. Enough gang members had escaped to spread the right story. And enough questions had been raised about James Cooper, the simple farmer who clearly wasn't just a farmer, to draw out their mysterious backer. Dawn over Eagles Rest. Local and state police swarmed the farm, processing the crime scene. James sat on his porch, playing his role, shaken but determined. Python had already been quietly transferred to federal custody. The official story? He fled the scene. 4 gang members sat cuffed in police cruisers, while forensic teams documented everything: the attempted intimidation, the signs of struggle. Every detail reinforced the narrative: a farmer, barely surviving a brutal attack, lucking his way into uncovering a massive criminal operation. Martinez approached, handing James a cup of coffee. 3 got away. Just like you planned. They're spooked. James sipped, nodding. Good. Let them tell the story their way. Makes it more believable. Martinez checked his phone. Python's been talking. Whatever training they've had, it didn't include resisting enhanced interrogation. He confirmed everything except one thing. Says he's never met their real boss. All orders come through encrypted channels. James watched officers load boxes of evidence from his exposed command center. Every single piece had been planted. Nothing that could compromise his real operation. Just enough to raise the right questions. They're testing us, he said quietly. Using the Storm Riders to probe law enforcement capabilities. Looking for weak points. Chief Anderson joined them, looking uneasy. Local news is here. You want me to handle the statements? James shook his head, adjusting his posture to look more traumatized. No. I need to do this. The chief nodded. They had rehearsed this part. The official story had to be airtight. A farmer. A lucky survivor. A town under siege. Nothing that hinted at an 8-year undercover operation. The first reporter approached. Amy Chen, small-town journalist, frequent customer at Jenny's Cafe. Mr. Cooper, can you tell us what happened? James let his hands shake slightly as he spoke, his voice carrying just the right mix of fear and defiance. The gang came for him. He got lucky. Fought back. And in the process, uncovered something bigger than anyone expected. I just did what anyone would do, he finished, staring at the wreckage of his farm. This is my home. My family's land. I couldn't just let them take that. The cameras captured every second. By noon, the entire town was talking. His phone buzzed constantly, neighbors checking in, offering help. Ruth Whitaker dropped off a casserole, fussing over him like a mother hen. Exactly the response they needed. Public sympathy meant the gang couldn't retaliate without consequences. At the Storm Riders compound, the panic was setting in. Martinez's team monitored encrypted chatter. Their backer was making moves. James took one last sip of coffee. Good. The real fight was just beginning. And when their boss finally came looking for him, James Cooper would be waiting.